So today we're building this, an open-air, semi-passively cooled PC that should be capable of doing some decent couch gaming at 4K and look relatively interesting while doing so. It's built on the Motif Monument by Yuel and the massive passive Noctua NHP1 CPU cooler. I'm planning on having this set up on my media console by my main TV and wanted a showpiece or conversation starter while also keeping noise to a minimum. The Motif Monument is a stunning piece of design and comes in 3 different finishes: a matte black, a white texture, and this one that I have here, which is an unfinished raw steel. This version saves you about $20 since you're not paying for the finishing from Yuel, but keep in mind that this chassis will need to be treated by yourself as the raw steel is prone to rust over time. My chassis came with a bit of surface rust caused by environmental changes during shipping, which is highlighted on their website before purchasing. I picked up some synthetic steel wool pads in medium and fine grit to sand down the surface, then refinish it with some clear coat. The process was relatively simple. Take off the surface rust with some medium steel wool pads, then do another pass with the fine pads to smoothen out some of those minor scratches. Once all the sanding was done, I taped up the threaded holes and sprayed 2 coats of clear coat to prevent any future rusting. I've had the case sitting under my TV for a couple of months now, and the metal seems to be holding up just fine. That was pretty much the most difficult part of this build, aside from being very particular with the component choices. For this build, I went with the Ryzen 5 5600G that I had sitting around for another project. It's technically not 100% supported by the NHP1, but we'll get into that a bit later. I paired it with a 16 gig kit of low profile Corsair Vengeance RAM running at 3200 MHz. It's way more than enough for this use case, but DDR4 and AM4 is a real steal of a deal at the moment, with current CPU prices dropping in anticipation of AM5. For the motherboard, I went with the Gigabyte B550i since it's one of the only motherboards that I had that would fit this massive CPU cooler without having to remove the SSD heatsink. It also has 2 M.2 slots that I've populated with a 2TB Crucial P1 drive to keep things clean and have enough storage space for plenty of games. Cable management is another big part of keeping this open design clean and visually appealing. I'd recommend going with a set of custom sleeve cables to give this build some extra pop, but this time around I've opted for the standard black braided cables from the Corsair SF600 power supply, paired with extensions to make them long enough to tuck neatly behind the motherboard and plug them into the power supply. These specific extensions came with black cable combs to really keep the cable management pristine. The GPU is the EVGA 2Fan 3060 Ti. Not the best card for AAA 4K gaming, but it'll work just fine for the titles I plan to play, and it's super compact while also lining up almost perfectly with the CPU cooler and the case. Sitting in the open air case gives this card tons of room to breathe, and that really shows with these thermals. While running Heaven 4.0 at 4K, we can see that the average GPU temp is around 72 degrees, with the fans capped at about 60% or 2000 RPM. There's some room for improvement when it comes to GPU thermals. By ramping up fan speeds to 80%, you can drop temps to about 69 degrees, but at this point you're introducing a lot of additional noise for some minimal improvements to gameplay and slightly lower temps. Another option would be to undervolt the card and have it run cooler and quieter without sacrificing much in performance. As an additional test, I played about 45 minutes of Elden Ring at 4K with settings set to high. Not only was this combo able to hold the game's capped 60 FPS limit, it also stayed relatively cool at 68 degrees with the fans running at 2000 RPM. During this test, the CPU averaged about 58.5 degrees. This is more of a realistic use case for this build, so to really test the CPU thermals, I ran the Blender Classroom benchmark. At all stock settings, the CPU did surprisingly well. The NHP1 was able to keep the 5600G at around 79 degrees. I was sorta curious and added a single slim Noctua NFA12 fan on top of the CPU cooler and tested both in an exhaust and intake orientation. I found that both orientations brought the temps down to 65 degrees while allowing the CPU to boost slightly higher. Noctua has a very detailed compatibility list for their NHP1, and the 5600G is technically not compatible without the help of that additional fan. But seeing as the use case for this PC is light gaming and a home theater PC, there aren't many scenarios that the CPU will sustain a full load for an extended period of time. If I wanted to use this as my full-time daily rig, then I would probably opt for something a little sleeker like a low-profile Noctua cooler or Noctua NHD15. With that much cooling potential, the sky's the limit for your CPU choice. I picked this case up a few months ago, but recently noticed that Yuel has an optional Monument booster backplate extension for a 240mm AIO. It would be interesting to see what the CPU thermals would be like, since there's essentially limitless airflow to the radiator. Now, there are a couple of downsides to building in the Motif Monument that might not make this build for everybody. Although you have an open, unobstructed, clean view of all your components, that also means it's susceptible to natural hazards in the environment like dust, pets, or even small toddlers. These are obviously all risks you're taking when building in any open air case and aren't exclusive to the Motif. But honestly, when I saw Yuel Beast post pictures of this clean, industrial looking combo, I thought form over function and I knew I wanted to recreate it. In terms of dust, the passive NHP1 cooler definitely helps prevent buildup, but it's always a good idea to keep an eye out for any additional dust that's pulled in from your GPU or power supply fans. So with all that said, was it really all worth it? Well, in total, this build costed just under $1,500, with the case being $260. That's the second most expensive component in this build, behind the GPU. If we're looking at it from a cost to performance standpoint, then no, probably not. There are much more affordable cases and cooler combos out there that would give you a better cooling performance at a lower price point. Swapping the case out to something like the budget-friendly $99 NR200 paired up with a $50 Hyper 212 would give you similar performance and save you roughly $200 that could be used to upgrade your GPU or any other components. But that's not exactly who this build is aimed towards. This is more of a bespoke boutique build for someone who wants a relatively quiet PC with an industrial look and feel and doesn't mind a bit of DIY. There are going to be some trade-offs with gaming and workload performance, but either way, I had some fun putting this thing together. Anyway, that pretty much sums it up for me. Thanks for watching, we'll see you in the next one, and later days.